Late in the night of April 17th, the sterile corridors of St. Mary's Hospital held only the low hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses on their rounds. For most, it was an ordinary evening in a building that never truly slept. But for the family of 15-year-old Claire Jennings, it was a night that would mark the beginning of a decade-long nightmare. Claire had spent the day visiting her mother, who was recovering from surgery after a sudden illness. She had been a constant presence in the hospital for days, keeping her mother company, fetching water, and quietly reading in the corner while her father came and went from work. By all accounts, she was responsible, quiet, and fiercely devoted to her mother. Around 1:15 a.m., cameras placed along the main corridor captured her leaving her mother's room. She carried a crumpled dollar bill in one hand and walked slowly toward the vending machine at the end of the hall. Her father, who had stepped outside briefly to take a phone call, would later say he assumed she was just grabbing a snack before trying to rest on the cot beside her mother's bed. But Claire never returned. The timeline was simple, but it quickly became chilling. At 1:17 a.m., hospital security footage showed Claire approaching the vending machine, standing still for a few moments and then stepping out of frame. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. When her father returned minutes later and saw her bed empty, he assumed she was in the restroom. When an hour passed and she didn't come back, panic set in. Nurses joined the search, combing through patient wings and common areas. At 2:30 a.m., hospital staff finally contacted security. By 3 a.m., the Jennings family was pleading with police officers who had arrived at the scene. Within hours, the building was locked down. What baffled investigators first was the silence of the cameras. St. Mary's had a modest but functional surveillance system. There were cameras in every major corridor, at every exit, and in the elevators. Reviewing the feeds, detectives expected to see Claire leave one area and emerge in another. But after the vending machine, her image never appeared again. No exit doors captured her departure. No stairwells showed her entering or leaving. Even the cameras at the main lobby failed to show any trace of her. It was as if she had simply stepped out of frame and evaporated into thin air. Detectives immediately suspected either a technical failure or tampering, but the system logs showed no evidence of hacking or interference. Several cameras had brief moments of static around the time she disappeared, but that wasn't unusual for aging equipment in the old building. The Jennings family clung to the hope that Claire had simply gotten turned around, maybe wandered into a restricted area or fallen asleep in a waiting room. But as dawn broke and search teams expanded their sweep, dread began to replace hope. Officers methodically checked every floor, every utility closet, every bathroom stall. They brought in a K-9 unit to sweep the hospital's grounds. Dogs picked up Claire's scent in the main corridor, but lost it just past the vending machine, exactly where the cameras had lost her. There was no trail leading outside, no indication that she had exited the building. To the officers on scene, the situation was almost impossible. How could a teenage girl vanish inside a place where every hallway connected to another and every exit was watched? As news of her disappearance spread through the hospital, tension grew. Nurses who had seen her just hours earlier broke down, recalling how polite she had been, how she had helped adjust her mother's blanket before leaving the room. Some patients reported hearing footsteps during the night, unusual in the otherwise quiet ward. A janitor told detectives he thought he saw a girl near the basement service elevator around 2 a.m., but he admitted he hadn't looked closely and couldn't be certain it was Claire. Every account was tinged with uncertainty, and every detail seemed to blur as exhaustion set in among staff who had been awake through the crisis. By mid-morning, suspicion began to creep in. Detectives considered whether a staff member could have lured her away. They interviewed doctors, nurses, maintenance workers, even security guards. Background checks were run. Several employees had troubling histories. A nurse with a prior substance abuse problem, a maintenance worker with a past assault charge, but no immediate links to Claire. Investigators also turned their gaze toward the family. In cases like these, they knew, the first circle of suspicion often included relatives. Detectives questioned her father intensely about his phone call and his movements during those critical minutes. They looked into her mother's condition, wondering if family stress or conflict might have played a role, but no evidence pointed directly toward them. What made the case even more unsettling was the lack of outside witnesses. No one saw Claire leave the building. No one reported her in the parking lot or on nearby streets. Hospitals are places of constant motion, yet on that night, not a single bystander had a memory that placed her anywhere beyond the vending machine corridor. The Jennings family was trapped between disbelief and horror, knowing that their daughter had vanished in a place where she should have been safest. As the first day closed, the story of the missing girl spread beyond the hospital walls. Local news stations picked it up, framing it as a baffling disappearance in one of the most monitored places imaginable. Crowds gathered outside, some holding signs of support, others whispering rumors about abductions, inside jobs, and cover-ups. For the family, the attention was unbearable. Every hour that passed without answers deepened their grief and sharpened the questions. If Claire wasn't on camera, if she wasn't outside, then where was she? How could she vanish inside a building designed to save lives? The search that began in those corridors would not end for years. What happened after Claire stepped out of frame would haunt investigators, tear apart her family, and leave the hospital forever shadowed by the night a 15-year-old girl disappeared in plain sight. And as detectives prepared for a second day of searching, no one realized that the truth of her disappearance was already hidden somewhere deep within the very walls they were standing in. The first 2 days of Claire Jennings's disappearance unfolded in a blur of flashing lights, hushed voices, and mounting dread. Within hours of the initial call, uniformed officers sealed every entrance and exit of St. Mary's Hospital. The automatic sliding doors that usually ushered in a steady stream of visitors were chained shut. Patrol cars lined the curb outside, their red and blue lights bathing the brick facade in a restless glow. Detectives treated the hospital like a crime scene, sweeping through the wings one by one, demanding records, questioning staff, and demanding cooperation. Families of patients were escorted out, while those admitted remained in their rooms under the nervous gaze of nurses who were suddenly as much witnesses as caretakers. At the center of the storm stood the Jennings family. Claire's father sat stiffly in a small waiting area near his wife's room, trying to answer officers' questions while his voice cracked with exhaustion and disbelief. His wife, groggy from medication and weakened by her surgery, clutched her daughter's jacket that had been left folded at the foot of her bed. On the side table sat Claire's phone, powered off, and the paperback novel she had been reading aloud just hours before she vanished. Everything she had brought with her remained behind, as if she had never intended to leave for long. The sight of those belongings sent a sharp chill through investigators. Teenagers might run away, but they rarely did so without their phone. Detectives moved quickly to the surveillance room, pulling every scrap of footage they could from the previous 12 hours. On the screen, Claire could be seen walking steadily down the corridor at 1:15 a.m., her hand brushing against the wall as she made her way toward the vending machine. A timestamp burned into the corner read 01:17:32. She leaned briefly, as if peering into the machine, and then stepped just out of frame. That was it. No footage of her turning around, no evidence of her continuing down the hallway. When investigators tried to follow her path through other cameras in the building, they encountered problems. Several feeds from that wing glitched around the same time, freezing for minutes or going dark entirely before resuming. The missing frames coincided almost exactly with the last moment Claire was seen. Technicians were called to examine the system, but their answers only deepened. Suspicion. The surveillance network was outdated, prone to failures, and often under repair. But the sudden gaps felt too precise, too convenient. Detectives considered the possibility of tampering, someone intentionally deleting footage, but the logs showed no sign of outside interference. Still, the mere suggestion left staff uneasy. If Claire's disappearance wasn't an accident, then someone inside the hospital may have been involved. Meanwhile, interviews with the night shift staff painted a confusing picture. A nurse swore she had seen Claire heading toward the bathroom just before 1 o'clock. Another insisted she saw her with a vending machine snack in hand a few minutes later. A janitor remembered a girl lingering near the service elevator around 2, but he admitted he only caught a glimpse and couldn't be certain. These accounts didn't align with the security footage, nor with each other. Investigators noted the contradictions and pressed harder, but fatigue, stress, and fear muddled recollections. In a hospital full of people who never truly rested, clarity proved hard to find. As dawn broke, the search widened. Officers inspected storage rooms, mechanical closets, and even laundry chutes. They brought dogs into the building, hoping scent trails would do what cameras could not. The dogs followed Claire's trail through the corridor, past the vending machine, and then stopped abruptly as if hitting an invisible wall. It was a dead end that mirrored the footage perfectly. Beyond that point, she simply didn't exist. By the afternoon of the second day, frustration had set in. Detectives had combed through her phone records, nothing unusual. They pulled her social media history, no signs of planned meetings or hidden conflicts. Teachers and friends described her as responsible and caring, not the type to disappear on her own. Yet investigators had little choice but to consider every angle, even those that seemed impossible. They looked into her father's alibi, scrutinizing the phone call he had stepped outside to take during the crucial minutes she vanished. They questioned whether her mother, still weak in her hospital bed, had noticed any odd visitors or heard voices in the night. Each inquiry ended the same way, with no solid lead. For the Jennings family, those first 48 hours were a blur of rising and falling hope. Every time a uniformed officer entered the waiting area, her father's eyes darted up, searching for news. Each time, the message was the same: nothing yet. He replayed the night in his head endlessly, wondering if stepping outside for that brief call had been the moment everything went wrong. Her mother, despite her frailty, asked again and again where her daughter was, each answer breaking her a little more. By the second night, the mood inside the hospital had shifted. Whispers echoed in the halls, patients asking nurses if it was true that a girl had gone missing under their watch. Reporters camped outside the locked doors, hungry for details. Inside, detectives gathered around a map of the hospital, marking locations, times, and statements, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to have no solution. And then came the first major blow to the investigation. When reviewing a second copy of the surveillance footage, technicians discovered not only missing frames, but entire segments of corrupted data. Hours of video from multiple cameras had been lost, including some covering staff areas and service corridors. Whether it was equipment failure or deliberate sabotage remained unclear, but either possibility pointed to something deeply troubling. For investigators, the first 48 hours had ended with more questions than answers. A girl had walked down a corridor and disappeared. Her belongings were untouched, her family devastated, and her trail cut short by technology that failed at the exact moment it was needed most. The leads were already beginning to crumble, and the case was quickly shifting from a search to a mystery that would haunt everyone who had been there that night. By the third day, the Jennings case was no longer just a private tragedy. It had become a public obsession. The hospital, once a place of quiet healing, now buzzed with tension and suspicion. Rumors spread like wildfire, whispered between patients leaning over their meal trays, between nurses huddled at the station, and among families pacing in waiting rooms. Some swore they had seen a patient in a gown wandering the halls late at night, a shadowy figure who never seemed to return to a room. Others whispered about a janitor who worked odd hours, sometimes disappearing into maintenance corridors for long stretches. Each story was passed along in hushed tones, each detail slightly distorted, but together they created a narrative of unease, of a hospital where something sinister could hide in plain sight. Outside, journalists gathered in clusters on the lawn, microphones ready, cameras pointed toward the locked glass doors. Headlines framed the disappearance as one of the most disturbing mysteries in recent memory. Reporters highlighted the haunting irony: a girl vanishing inside a hospital, a place meant for safety and protection, They pressed detectives for answers, demanding explanations for how security cameras could fail at such a critical moment. When authorities offered little beyond vague assurances that the investigation was ongoing, the media filled the silence with speculation. Talk shows debated whether she had been abducted, lured away by someone she trusted, or had stumbled into a part of the hospital no one wanted to talk about. Detectives, meanwhile, were working to separate fact from rumor. They began pulling employment records, digging into staff backgrounds one by one. The hospital was a sprawling institution with hundreds of employees, from doctors with impeccable credentials to part-time cleaners and contractors. Buried in the files, investigators found troubling histories. A nurse on the night shift had once faced accusations of negligence in another hospital. A security guard had a history of theft and had bounced between jobs in different cities. A maintenance worker had a misdemeanor assault charge from years earlier, something that had been quietly overlooked when he was hired. Each discovery was noted, each individual questioned, but none of the details tied directly to Claire's disappearance. Interviews grew more intense as detectives tried to untangle contradictions. One patient claimed they had seen a girl who matched Claire's description stepping into an elevator around 1:30 a.m., yet the elevator log showed no movement at that time. Another insisted a man in scrubs had been lingering in the vending area, but no such person was identified among the staff on duty. When asked about the janitor with unusual hours, co-workers explained that he often worked overnight because he preferred solitude, not because he had anything to hide. Every promising lead seemed to dissolve under scrutiny, leaving investigators with fragments of stories, but no clear picture. At the same time, whispers began to spread beyond the hospital walls. In the Jenningses' neighborhood, neighbors speculated about tensions within the family. There were suggestions of arguments over money, hints at strained relationships between relatives who had gathered in the hospital room. Detectives had to consider every possibility, no matter how painful. They questioned Claire's father again and again about his late-night phone call, about whether anyone in the family might have wanted to harm the girl. Each time, he answered with raw frustration, his grief evident, but his innocence impossible to prove absolutely. The idea that the tragedy might not have come from outside, but from within, cast a shadow over the family as well as the staff. Inside the hospital, the tension was reaching a breaking point. Nurses reported feeling watched, staff whispered about resigning, and patients were afraid to be left alone. The Jennings family could feel it too. Every time they walked through the halls, they noticed eyes following them, whispers softening as they passed. It was as if everyone in the building was waiting for some dark truth to break open, some confession that would explain what had happened to Claire. But that moment never came. Journalists amplified the fear. They published profiles of employees with troubled pasts, plastered their photographs across television screens, and interviewed former colleagues who shared anecdotes that sounded damning but lacked proof. Each story deepened public suspicion, painting the hospital as a place filled with secrets. Yet despite the sensationalism, investigators knew they had little that would stand in court. Suspicion was not evidence, and without evidence, there was no case. By the end of the week, the investigation had become mired in rumor and speculation. Every person in the hospital had become a potential suspect. Every rumor another distraction pulling detectives away from the few hard facts they had. Claire had been there one moment and gone the next. Cameras had failed, memories had blurred, and the truth remained buried beneath layers of conflicting testimony and broken trust. The whispers in the halls would not stop, and in time they would become part of the case's legacy. Stories of ghosts in hospital gowns, of staff who knew more than they said, of a girl who walked into a vending area and never returned. But for detectives, the rumors were only noise, static that drowned out the faint signals of truth they were desperate to find. And as the first week closed, they realized the trail was already beginning to grow cold, forcing them to widen their search beyond the hospital walls. By the end of the first week, detectives faced the grim reality that searching the hospital alone would not be enough. With no new footage and no reliable witnesses, the investigation pushed outward. Police units spread into the surrounding streets, canvassing neighborhoods and speaking with shopkeepers who might have seen a teenage girl wandering late at night. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the city blocks and nearby woods with infrared cameras, while K-9 teams combed through alleys, construction sites, and the edges of parks. Claire's face, once known only to friends and neighbors, was suddenly everywhere, on billboards, posters taped to street lamps, and in news broadcasts flashing across living rooms throughout the region. Her wide smile and soft eyes became a constant reminder of a mystery that was tightening its grip on the entire community. At first, there was a sense of urgency, a collective belief that she could still be found alive if everyone searched hard enough. Volunteers joined police to walk the wooded areas near the hospital, combing through underbrush and drainage ditches. Parents held their children closer, fearing that if Claire could disappear so easily, so could anyone else. The Jennings family made public pleas, standing under the harsh lights of press conferences, their voices cracking as they begged for information. Yet behind the cameras, the strain was becoming unbearable. Then, on the 9th day, hope seemed to flare again. A clerk at a gas station 5 miles from the hospital reported seeing a girl who matched Claire's description late at night. The girl had been quiet, withdrawn, and seemed nervous as she purchased a bottle of water before quickly leaving. Surveillance footage from the station was pulled immediately. Investigators studied the grainy video frame by frame, desperate for confirmation. The figure's height, build, and hair length seemed close, but the quality was too poor to be definitive. The girl never looked directly at the camera, and no vehicle license plates were clear enough to track. A manhunt followed, with officers scouring the nearby area, knocking on doors and questioning drivers, but no trace of the girl was ever found again. The gas station lead, once promising, quickly crumbled under scrutiny. Some detectives doubted the sighting had been Claire at all. The uncertainty left the family torn between a fleeting sense of hope and crushing disappointment. Claire's father, who had clung to every development with the desperation of a man unwilling to accept the worst, began to unravel under the repeated letdowns. Her mother, still recovering physically, withdrew further, often staring blankly at the jacket left behind in her hospital room. The sighting had promised answers, but its collapse only deepened the family's despair. Meanwhile, investigators dealt with an overwhelming flood of tips. Some claimed to have seen Claire in shopping malls, on buses, or even in neighboring states. Others suggested more sinister theories, kidnapping rings, organ trafficking, or staff conspiracies that reached higher than anyone wanted to admit. Detectives chased down each report, but every single one led to a dead end. The cycle repeated over and over, a burst of hope followed by crushing silence. As weeks passed, the search began to shift from frantic to methodical. Officers established checkpoints along highways, distributing flyers to motorists. Forested areas on the city's outskirts were combed with increasing intensity, yet nothing was found. Search dogs continued to pick up traces near the hospital, but lost the trail every time, just as they had on the first night. To many investigators, it felt like chasing a shadow. Inside the Jennings household, grief began to reshape itself into anger. Arguments flared over who was to blame, over whether too much trust had been placed in the hospital, or whether the family had done enough in those first critical hours. Relatives who had once stood together fractured under the weight of uncertainty. Neighbors noticed the change. What had once been a united front became fragmented, each person haunted by the idea that if only they had done one thing differently, Claire might still be alive. Detectives, too, felt the pressure. Some began to question whether they were missing something inside the hospital itself. Could the answer have been within those walls all along, overlooked in the rush to search outside? Yet without new evidence, they were forced to continue expanding outward, knowing every day that passed made survival less likely. The case that had once united a community in fear and sympathy was slowly becoming one of frustration. The face on the billboards remained, the news stories continued, but behind each update was the harsh reality that nothing new had been discovered. A teenage girl had vanished from a corridor, and despite the helicopters, the dogs, and the endless manhunts, she remained gone. And then, just as quickly as the investigation had swelled outward, the leads dried up completely. Detectives found themselves circling the same unanswered questions, staring again at the same grainy footage, wondering if the truth had been within reach all along. The search had expanded as far as it could, and yet it had yielded nothing. For the Jennings family, the hope that had once carried them was beginning to fracture into silence, leaving them with only the unbearable weight of not knowing. As the weeks stretched into months, the Jennings case shifted from an urgent manhunt into a painstaking grind. The early intensity, the helicopters, the search parties, the press conferences, faded into methodical but fruitless investigation. Detectives moved through every possibility, clinging to any thread that might explain how a 15-year-old girl could walk into a corridor and never be seen again. They interviewed every patient admitted that night, even those too ill to speak clearly, asking if they remembered voices in the hall, footsteps, or anything unusual. They pored over staff schedules and visitor logs, searching for inconsistencies. But the more they pushed, the more the investigation seemed to circle itself. One theory that emerged was that Claire had stumbled into an area of the hospital few people ever saw. St. Mary's was an aging structure pieced together over decades of renovations. Investigators ordered the building's blueprints, some of which were incomplete or outdated, and began exploring spaces beyond the patient floors. What they found were hidden service tunnels, old boiler rooms, and sealed storage areas that hadn't been entered in years. Some of these spaces were damp, filled with rusting equipment and collapsed ceiling tiles. Teams scoured each one, their flashlights cutting through the dust, but every sweep ended the same way. Empty rooms, no trace of Claire. For a brief moment, the discovery of these tunnels reignited public speculation. If Claire had wandered into one by mistake, perhaps she had become trapped. Yet nothing supported that theory. No scraps of clothing, no personal belongings, no signs of anyone having been there. The longer the searches went on without results, the more criticism began to mount against the police. Reporters accused them of incompetence, of failing to secure evidence in those first critical hours. The missing surveillance footage became a focal point for outrage. How could entire chunks of video vanish without explanation? Officials insisted it was a technical failure, but many in the community believed the truth had been hidden or covered up. Inside the Jennings family home, time felt frozen. Claire's room remained untouched, her bed neatly made, her school notebooks left open as if she might walk back in at any moment. Her father clung to the investigation, calling detectives weekly, asking about every rumor he heard, demanding updates on every scrap of information. Her mother, still fragile from her hospital stay, sank deeper into grief, replaying the night in her mind until the memory itself began to fray. They received letters from strangers, some offering prayers, others insisting they knew what had happened. Each one was a reminder that the world hadn't forgotten, but also that no real answers had been found. For the detectives still assigned to the case, the pressure weighed heavily. Each interview and search felt less promising than the last. They had combed through maintenance logs, checking whether any repairs or unusual activity occurred that night. They traced the movements of staff and visitors, comparing times and cross-referencing statements, but the records told them nothing. Leads that once seemed solid, like the gas station sighting, proved to be false trails. And yet, even with the mounting frustration, they could never bring themselves to close the file. The case remained open, marked by a thick binder of reports that offered only questions, never answers. By the 6-month mark, the story that had once dominated headlines slipped further down the news cycle. New crimes, new tragedies replaced it, and reporters stopped gathering outside the hospital gates. The hospital administration, eager to restore its reputation, quietly scaled back cooperation with the media and reassured patients that it was safe to return. Staff members went back to their routines, though unease lingered in their glances and the way they locked storage rooms a little tighter. For many employees, The memory of Claire Jennings became something unspoken, a ghost that haunted the edges of their workday but was rarely acknowledged out loud. The Jennings family, however, had no such luxury. For them, time was split into before and after. Holidays passed in silence, birthdays marked with empty chairs at the table. Neighbors offered sympathy at first, but over time even their visits grew less frequent, replaced by awkward nods and quick glances. The weight of not knowing proved heavier than any definitive loss. Without a body, without a trace, hope remained alive, but so did despair. By the end of the first year, the case was referred to only as cold. Detectives were rotated to new assignments, though one or two still carried the file under their arm, unable to let it go entirely. They knew the odds of solving it were slim, but something about the details, the vanishing inside a monitored hospital, the missing footage, the belongings left untouched, refused to make sense. It was the kind of case that burrowed into the back of the mind, a riddle with no solution. For the family, though, there was no moving on. To them, Claire's absence was a daily wound, reopened each time they walked past her room or heard her name whispered in town. They lived suspended in a limbo of unanswered questions, unable to grieve fully, unable to heal. And though the world around them quietly returned to normal, they remained locked in the same night, waiting for a truth that refused to come. It would take another 10 years before the silence surrounding Claire's disappearance was broken, when the walls of the hospital themselves finally gave up a secret they had held all along. 10 years is a long time to carry silence, and for the Jennings family, silence became the only constant. In the months after Claire vanished, the family tried to hold together, but grief has a way of grinding down even the strongest bonds. Her mother, weakened from her surgery and haunted by the night her daughter left her side, never recovered. Each passing year chipped away at her health and her spirit. She kept Claire's jacket folded at the end of her bed until the day she died, never receiving the answers she had begged detectives for. Her death certificate listed complications from illness, but those closest to her whispered that heartbreak was just as much to blame. Claire's father carried the weight differently. In the early years, he remained active in the search, calling investigators weekly, taping missing posters to telephone poles long after the paper had yellowed in the sun. But as leads dried up and hope evaporated, he grew distant, retreating into long silences. Neighbors would catch glimpses of him sitting on the porch at night, staring out into the dark as if waiting for something that would never come. Eventually, even he stopped attending the annual candlelight vigils that once brought the community together. For the rest of the family, the disappearance left cracks that never healed. Cousins who had once been close to Claire avoided speaking about her, unable to handle the weight of uncertainty. Holidays grew tense and fragmented, marked not by joy but by the absence of a teenager who should have been there. By the 5th year, the Jennings family was no longer a family in the way people remembered them. They were individuals moving through life with their own scars, bound only by a shared loss that none of them could make sense of. Outside the family, however, the mystery took on a life of its own. St. Mary's Hospital gained an unsettling reputation. Patients whispered about the girl who had vanished inside its walls. Some claimed to have seen her reflection in the glass near the vending machine corridor. Others spoke of hearing footsteps in the halls late at night, long after visiting hours had ended. She became a local legend, the hospital ghost, a story retold by nurses to new staff and whispered among patients who already feared the darkness of the building at night. True crime communities online seized on the case, dissecting every detail that had been made public. Amateur sleuths mapped out the hospital blueprints, pointing out possible routes Claire might have taken that investigators had overlooked. Theories sprouted endlessly: that she had been abducted by a staff member and smuggled out in a laundry cart, that she had stumbled into a black market organ trafficking ring, or that she had simply been the victim of a catastrophic accident the hospital had covered up to protect itself from liability. Each thread was debated with the passion of people who had never known Claire but felt bound to her story. For some, the case became an obsession. The police, meanwhile, kept the file technically open but functionally inactive. Detectives had rotated in and out of the department, each new set of eyes glancing over the reports, only to conclude the same thing. There was nothing more to follow. The surveillance gaps, the conflicting witness accounts, the lack of physical evidence, it all led nowhere. Every few years, a new detective would inherit the case and make promises to the family or to the public, only for the trail to go cold again. By the 10th year, the Jennings disappearance was less a case than a symbol. It represented the limits of law enforcement, the imperfection of human memory, and the kind of haunting failure that no amount of training or procedure could explain away. In the town itself, Claire's story became part of the landscape. Her missing posters had long since been torn down, but her name lingered in conversation, always with a certain weight. Parents warned their children not to wander off in public places, invoking her name as a cautionary tale. Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the hospital at night, to walk the same corridor where she had last been seen. Nurses still avoided the vending machine area when they were alone, their unease fed by a decade of rumor and fear. Yet for all the talk, the reality remained the same. No one knew what had happened to her. 10 years of silence had turned the truth into a void filled with speculation. To the Jennings family, the lack of resolution was unbearable. To the community, it was a wound that never fully closed. And to the police, it was a reminder of a mystery that had beaten them, one that mocked the idea of closure. But time has a way of shifting shadows. What everyone had come to believe was unsolvable, what the family had resigned themselves to never knowing, was already waiting to be uncovered. Hidden behind walls and buried beneath routine maintenance, the secret of what really happened to Claire Jennings was still inside the hospital, sealed away where no one thought to look. And after 10 years of silence, those walls were about to speak. By the spring of the 10th year, St. Mary's Hospital was showing its age. The once proud institution had become outdated, its wings patched together like pieces of a puzzle from another era. Complaints about electrical issues, water leaks, and unreliable heating had piled up for years until the administration finally approved a major renovation. For most, it was a chance to modernize the building and wipe away the shadows of its past. For those who remembered the Jennings case, however, the thought of tearing into the hospital's walls brought unease. Rumors had long circulated that if the truth about Claire was ever found, it would be hidden somewhere deep inside the building itself. Construction crews arrived with jackhammers, saws, and dumpsters, stripping away decades of drywall, pipes, and wiring. As walls came down and old corridors were exposed, workers stumbled on forgotten corners of the hospital that hadn't been entered in decades. They uncovered sealed storage rooms filled with rusted equipment, dusty furniture, and paperwork from another generation. Each discovery reminded staff of how much of the hospital's structure had become a maze of neglected spaces. To the workers, it was just part of the job. To those who knew the Jennings story, it was unsettling proof of how easily someone could vanish inside. The real shock came during work in the basement near the boiler room. The air was thick with dust and heat, the walls streaked with years of rust. A small crew had been tasked with replacing piping when one of them noticed a maintenance panel hidden behind layers of corroded metal. It wasn't marked on their plans. Curious, they pried it open, expecting to find more outdated wiring or old valves. Instead, the flashlight beams fell on a small cavity tucked behind the wall. At first, it seemed empty, just another forgotten space. But then one of the men spotted fabric, faded, torn, and half buried in dust. When they pulled it free, the room fell silent. It was a sweater, its threads unraveling from age, but still intact enough to recognize the size and style. Beside it lay a bracelet, tarnished, but unmistakably a piece of jewelry. And wedged against the wall was a notebook, its cover warped from time, its pages yellowed and brittle. The workers didn't need to guess long. They had all heard the story of the girl who vanished here 10 years earlier. They knew exactly what they were holding. The discovery stopped the renovation instantly. The site was sealed, and calls went out to the police. By the time detectives arrived, word had already spread through the hospital like wildfire. Staff whispered nervously in break rooms, some refusing to go near the basement at all. Reporters, long absent from St. Mary's, returned within hours, crowding the gates with cameras and questions. For the first time in a decade, the Jennings case wasn't just a fading memory. It was alive again. Detectives who had once worked the case were called back to the scene, their expressions tight as they studied the items spread out on evidence tables. There was no doubt. They matched the belongings Claire's parents had described years earlier. The torn sweater was one her mother remembered folding carefully in her hospital room. The bracelet had been a birthday gift from her aunt. The notebook, though water-damaged, contained faint scribbles of Claire's handwriting on its first pages. These were not random objects discarded by chance. They were hers. The basement cavity was treated as a fresh crime scene. Forensic teams documented every inch, scraping dust, taking samples, and searching for additional evidence. Yet the space itself told a chilling story. It was narrow and suffocating, hidden in such a way that no one could have stumbled across it by accident. The panel that concealed it had been sealed so tightly, it was clear no one had entered or exited since the day it was closed. To investigators, it suggested only two possibilities. Either Claire had somehow crawled in on her own and been trapped, or someone had placed her belongings there deliberately. For the Jennings family, the phone call confirming the discovery reopened wounds that had never healed. Claire's father, older now and visibly worn down by years of grief, arrived at the hospital and stood silently as detectives explained what had been found. He said little, only nodded, his face pale. To him, the sweater, bracelet, and notebook were more than evidence. They were proof that his daughter had been here all along, proof that the hospital he once trusted had concealed the truth for a decade. The discovery electrified the community. News outlets broadcast the images of the recovered items, reigniting public outrage. For those who had whispered about the hospital ghost, it felt like confirmation that the legend had roots in reality. For investigators, it meant starting over. Every lead, every theory, every suspect would need to be reconsidered in light of the fact that Claire's belongings had been hidden inside the hospital itself. The renovation, meant to modernize St. Mary's and erase its past, had instead torn open the one secret everyone thought would never surface. And as the basement filled with the flashing lights of cameras and the heavy presence of detectives, one question returned louder than ever. If Claire's belongings had been hidden behind that wall, what else was concealed within it? The answer would come soon enough, and it would change everything about how her disappearance was understood. When detectives sealed off the basement and declared it an active crime scene, the hospital's atmosphere shifted instantly. What had begun as a routine renovation site became the epicenter of one of the most chilling discoveries in the city's history. Forensic vans lined the street outside, their crews carrying in cases of specialized tools. Every inch of the boiler room was photographed, measured, and cataloged. What lay behind the rusted panel would no longer be treated as a forgotten cavity. It was now a tomb. Inside, the space was suffocatingly narrow, no more than a hidden crawl within the wall. Forensic teams worked carefully, brushing away layers of dust and debris until fragments began to emerge. Pieces of fabric, brittle from time, clung to the rough concrete. A scrap of shoe sole, cracked and discolored, lay half buried under sediment. And then came the most haunting find. Small bones scattered within the cavity, reduced and brittle but unmistakably human. For a moment, silence gripped the room as investigators realized what they were. Uncovering. 10 years of speculation had just ended. Claire Jennings had never left the hospital. The remains were removed slowly, wrapped with the care given to any victim, no matter how much time had passed. Forensic pathologists laid them out on sterile tables, reconstructing what they could. The fragments told a story of confinement and slow decay. The absence of larger skeletal pieces suggested collapse under the weight of years, or perhaps an incomplete recovery. DNA testing was rushed, and within days the results were conclusive. The bones belonged to Claire. Equally important was the notebook discovered beside the remains. Conservators treated the delicate pages with precision, gently separating them to reveal faded ink. The entries were fragmented and incomplete, the handwriting faint but recognizable as Claire's. The sentences revealed desperation, confusion, and fear. Trapped, can't breathe, hear them walking. Another line trailed off mid-sentence, smudged beyond recognition. Though the writings were brief, they confirmed the unthinkable. She had been alive when she entered the cavity. She had tried to record her last moments. The discovery left investigators with as many questions as answers. How had Claire ended up here? Had she wandered into the hidden space herself, lost and disoriented in the hospital's labyrinth of old maintenance passages? Or had someone forced her inside, sealing the panel afterward to ensure she would never be found? The notebook hinted at awareness of movement nearby, suggesting she could hear others while she was trapped. Theories multiplied instantly. Some detectives argued she had discovered the cavity by accident during her late-night walk. Others believed the positioning of the panel suggested deliberate concealment, the kind only someone familiar with the hospital's structure could have carried out. For Claire's family, the confirmation of her death was a devastating milestone. Her father, who had lived a decade clinging to the hope she might still be alive, broke down when informed that the bones and belongings were hers. There was relief in knowing she had not been abducted far away, that she had not suffered at the hands of strangers beyond their reach. But that relief was hollow, crushed by the reality that she had been trapped within the very hospital where he had last seen her, just a few feet below where they had searched so many times. Public outrage exploded as the news spread. How could a hospital allow a child to remain hidden inside its walls for 10 years? Why hadn't earlier searches uncovered the cavity? The hospital administration deflected, insisting that the space hadn't been listed on any blueprints. Critics argued that the institution had failed not only in preventing her disappearance, but in its responsibility to uncover the truth sooner. For a community that had spent years haunted by rumors of organ trafficking, cover-ups, and kidnappings, the reality felt somehow even worse. Claire had died alone, unheard, in a forgotten corner of the very building where she should have been safe. Detectives continued to sift through the evidence, hoping for clarity. The condition of the remains made it difficult to determine an exact cause of death. No clear injuries could be identified, no definitive signs of foul play. But the positioning of the belongings suggested she had been conscious long enough to try and write, long enough to realize she would not be found. It was a detail that haunted every investigator assigned to the case. The reopening of the Jennings file sent shockwaves through the ranks of law enforcement. Detectives who had once searched the hospital in those first frantic days now revisited their reports, scrutinizing every oversight. Could they have missed the cavity behind the panel? Could they have saved her if they had known where to look? For many, the revelation felt like a personal failure, the kind that would never leave them. The discovery ended one decade of silence, but it did not bring resolution. Instead, it sharpened the mystery. The notebook's broken lines and the presence of her belongings raised new, agonizing questions. Was Claire's entrapment an accident? Or had someone with knowledge of the hospital's hidden spaces ensured she would never return? With her remains finally found, the focus shifted from whether she was alive to how and why she had ended up behind that wall at all. And as the investigation reignited under the harsh light of renewed public scrutiny, one fact stood above the rest. The answers everyone had been waiting for were buried inside a single hidden cavity of concrete and dust. But the truth of how Claire Jennings had gotten there was still out of reach, and the search for that truth was about to take on a new intensity. With Claire's remains confirmed, detectives were forced to revisit every angle of the case that had once gone cold. Old suspects, former employees, and forgotten rumors were brought back under the microscope. For a decade, theories had swirled without evidence. Now, with the discovery of her belongings and her bones hidden behind a wall, the question shifted from where she had gone to how she had ended up there, and whether anyone had helped seal her fate. The first theory investigators revisited was the possibility of an accident. Could Claire, wandering late at night, have stumbled into the cavity on her own? St. Mary's was full of hidden service spaces, maintenance shafts, sealed storage closets, and narrow crawl spaces that hadn't been touched in years. Detectives considered the idea that she may have opened the panel herself, curious or disoriented, and become trapped when it sealed shut. The notebook fragments supported the idea that she had been conscious and aware for some time. But skeptics pointed out that the panel had been rusted and bolted from the outside. It was unlikely that a teenage girl could have opened it without tools. If she hadn't gone in on her own, then someone must have put her there. That suspicion turned eyes back toward hospital staff. Detectives combed through employment rosters from a decade earlier, hunting for anyone with knowledge of the building's less accessible spaces. Maintenance workers, security guards, and janitors became the focus. Among them was a man who had worked nights in the basement at the time of Claire's disappearance. Now, elderly and long retired, he was tracked down and questioned once more. He admitted something he hadn't shared in the original investigation. In the weeks after she vanished, he had occasionally heard what he thought were scratching noises coming from the boiler area. He assumed it was rodents trapped in the walls, and he ignored it. Confronted with the truth a decade later, his admission chilled detectives. If those sounds hadn't been vermin, but Claire desperately trying to get attention, it meant she had been alive inside that cavity while the world searched for her everywhere else. The possibility that she had been locked inside intentionally raised darker questions. Could a staff member have used their knowledge of the hospital's layout to lure her in? Detectives examined disciplinary reports from that year, singling out employees with histories of misconduct or unexplained absences. Some had long since moved away, others had died. Yet no direct evidence connected them to Claire. Theories of malice remained speculative, but the idea was impossible to dismiss. Someone who knew the hospital could have exploited its hidden corners to ensure she was never found. For the Jennings family, the theories brought little comfort. Learning that Claire had not been taken miles away, but had remained just beneath their feet in the same building where they had searched and prayed, was unbearable. Her father replayed the memory of standing in that corridor, looking for her, while she may have been only a wall away. The guilt was crushing, even though there had been nothing he could have done. Family members argued over the details, whether it was an accident or a deliberate act, whether the hospital bore responsibility, or whether someone specific should be blamed. Grief fractured into blame, and blame left scars that would never heal. The community, too, latched onto the new revelations with renewed intensity. True crime forums lit up with speculation about cover-ups, questioning why the elderly maintenance worker had never mentioned the noises before. Some believed the hospital had pressured staff into silence to protect itself from liability. Others insisted Claire had been the victim of a crime of opportunity, targeted by someone who had slipped away unnoticed. With no definitive cause of death, every theory remained alive, and every one of them carried its own horrors. Detectives faced the same frustration. The evidence pulled from the cavity was degrading and incomplete. The bones bore no clear signs of trauma. The notebook was heartbreaking but not definitive. Without physical proof of foul play, prosecutors had nothing to build a case on. Theories could be revisited, suspects re-interviewed, but the investigation remained a puzzle with missing pieces. Yet the discovery of Claire's remains reignited public anger and forced law enforcement to confront their past failures. They had searched that hospital top to bottom again and again, yet never found the panel. They had missed the one place where she actually was. For many, that failure was as devastating as the truth itself. The realization that she had been so close, that her cries may have gone unheard within earshot of investigators, became the most haunting detail of all. As the investigation dragged on, one question grew louder than the rest. Had Claire Jennings died because of a tragic accident inside a neglected hospital, or had she been silenced by someone who knew exactly how to make her vanish? It was a question that no amount of forensic analysis could answer fully. And with her remains finally laid to rest, the truth of her final moments remained locked inside the same silence that had consumed her for a decade. The discovery of Claire Jennings's remains inside the hospital brought headlines back with a force no one expected. For weeks, the media circled St. Mary's like vultures, demanding accountability. Press conferences were tense, with officials trying to balance transparency and damage control. But when the coroner finally issued the official report, it left everyone unsatisfied. The cause of death was listed as undetermined. The remains were too decomposed, the evidence too degraded to establish exactly how or why she had died. Forensic analysis confirmed she had been trapped alive, but whether she had entered the cavity herself or been placed there by another person was a question no science could answer. Authorities leaned toward an explanation that was easier to digest. Claire may have wandered into the boiler area during a temporary power outage the night she vanished. They suggested she might have mistaken the hidden panel for a doorway, stepped inside, and become trapped when it closed behind her. To investigators, it provided a plausible accident narrative, one that spared the hospital from the worst accusations and closed the case without indicting any single individual. But for those who had followed the story, it rang hollow. The idea that a teenage girl could push through a panel bolted from the outside and that no one heard her for days was difficult to accept. Whispers quickly grew louder in the community. Families of patients and former staff members circulated stories of cover-ups. Nurses recalled how administrators discouraged discussion of the case years earlier, urging staff to focus on patients instead of rumors. Maintenance workers admitted there were spaces in the hospital even they didn't fully understand, suggesting that only someone with specialized knowledge could have known about the cavity where Claire was found. To many, it seemed less like an accident and more like deliberate concealment, but proof remained elusive. For the Jennings family, the official explanation provided no peace. Claire's father could not reconcile the report with the reality that her belongings, carefully arranged, had been sealed away with her. He replayed the moments over and over, the last glimpse of his daughter walking down the hall, the hours of searching, the days of interviews, all while she may have been only feet below. Her mother, who had died years earlier, never learned the truth. That knowledge weighed heavily on the family, who believed she had carried her daughter's absence to the grave, robbed of the closure she deserved. The broader community, too, remained divided. Some accepted the accident theory, choosing to believe it was a tragic but unintended event. Others were convinced darker forces had been at play. Online forums dissected every scrap of evidence, magnifying photographs of the panel, debating the wording of the coroner's report, and scrutinizing every old interview given by staff. For them, the mystery had not been solved. It had simply shifted into a new stage, one where the truth might never be fully proven. What was undeniable, however, was the chilling reality that for 10 long years, Claire Jennings had been just beneath the hospital floor. Families had walked those corridors, nurses had pushed carts past the boiler room, and detectives had scoured the building, all while her body remained hidden behind a panel no one thought to open. It was a truth that left a permanent stain on the hospital and on the investigation itself. Detectives closed their active file reluctantly, noting that without new evidence, no charges could ever be pursued. The Jennings case was filed away, not with answers, but with a final reminder of its failures. For those who had worked it from the beginning, the ending was bitter. They had promised the family resolution. What they delivered was only the outline of a tragedy, not its explanation. The story faded again from headlines, but the unease never left. For the Jennings family, closure never arrived. They buried Claire with the belongings found beside her, but her father admitted privately that the burial felt hollow. He could not shake the thought that she had been so close, that she might have even been alive when he was searching for her, and that the opportunity to save her had slipped away unnoticed. For him, the hospital would forever be a place not of healing, but of loss. And so, the case of Claire Jennings became something larger than itself, a symbol of how answers can remain hidden in plain sight, of how silence can consume truth, and of how sometimes, even when a body is found, the mystery never truly ends. 10 years after she vanished, the world finally knew where Claire Jennings had been. But the question of how she got there and why would remain unanswered forever.